They told you to smile, to stay polite, to blend in even when your gut screamed otherwise. You learned early that obedience was survival, that silence kept you safe, that questioning made you dangerous. You watched people who spoke too loudly disappear behind polite smiles and closed doors. You learned to bow while they built cages around your mind and called them opportunities. You became fluent in compliance, mistaking it for peace. Every rule they fed you, be kind, be quiet, be grateful, wasn't kindness. It was conditioning, a manual disguised as morality. And you followed it because you were taught that rebellion meant exile. You were programmed long before you noticed. Every classroom, every screen, every handshake whispered the same command: conform or vanish. They trained you to apologize for existing, to shrink before you were seen. They rewarded obedience with acceptance, the soft poison of belonging. You said yes when your instincts begged for no. You agreed to things that burned your soul because approval felt like air. And when you started suffocating, they told you to breathe deeper inside their system. You weren't living, you were repeating, functioning like a machine that mistook its cage for structure. They called it society, you called it stability. But deep down, something ancient in you began to stir. The part that remembers freedom before language, before law, before loyalty. That voice kept whispering under the noise. You were not born to kneel. But every time it rose, someone you trusted made you doubt it. Parents who feared rejection more than truth. Teachers who punished individuality. Friends who smiled while cutting pieces off your identity to fit you into their version of normal. And you obeyed because rebellion without power felt suicidal. You thought staying small was survival. It wasn't. It was slow erasure. You see, control doesn't always wear chains. Sometimes it wears concern. They said it was for your own good, to play nice, to stay humble, to never make anyone uncomfortable with your potential. That's how they kept you compliant. They broke your will, not your body. They made you worship balance while they took your edge. They told you ambition was arrogance, silence was virtue, and loyalty meant obedience. Every belief, every habit, every reaction you have now, it wasn't chosen, it was installed. Like code written in your subconscious by people who profit from your predictability. You didn't grow up, you were programmed to perform. The betrayal wasn't personal, it was systemic, generational, a cycle disguised as culture. You were born into a world that feeds on your submission, that thrives when you doubt yourself, that celebrates your restraint while it exploits your patience. You were taught to follow rules written by cowards who fear what you'd become if you stop. The tragedy isn't that they lied to you, it's that they made you lie to yourself. You called your fear responsibility. You called your hesitation kindness. You called your exhaustion purpose. Every word twisted until obedience looked noble, until you forgot that the human spirit was designed for war, not worship. But here's the cruel brilliance. They left cracks in the system. Moments of silence where truth leaks through. You've felt it, haven't you? That pulse in your chest when someone tries to control you. That surge of clarity when you realize you've been following orders no one ever questioned. That's not rebellion, that's resurrection, the beginning of unlearning. They wanted you soft, compliant, predictable. But you noticed, you smiled when they expected you to bow. That's when fear shifted. Not yours, theirs. Because the moment you see the strings the puppet show collapses, the moment you stop apologizing for breathing, their entire illusion shatters. You were programmed to obey, but now you're remembering how to build your own code. And that smile, that was the first act of war. They told you to obey before you ever learned to breathe on your own, not through words, but through tone. The sharp disapproval in a teacher's sigh, the heavy silence after you questioned too much. They trained you to flinch before authority, to confuse compliance with goodness. You learned that comfort was granted to the quiet one. That obedience kept you safe. That safety was survival. But no one told you that obedience kills faster than war. Because when you obey long enough, you forget how to see the bars. You start decorating the cage. You call it peace. You were programmed to wait for permission to speak, to move, to become. Every time you had an instinct, someone rewired it. Be nice, be patient. Don't make it awkward. Those weren't lessons, they were commands. Psychological conditioning disguised as manners. You became predictable. manageable, harmless. The system loves people like that, those who whisper instead of roar, who question themselves before questioning power. And so you obeyed because rebellion felt dangerous, and danger meant rejection. They built your identity like software, code written by the hands of fear. You started mistaking silence for virtue. You learned to apologize for existing too loudly. You held your tongue when you should have burned the room down with truth. You stayed loyal to people who fed on your hesitation. And every time you almost broke free, they dangled the word grateful in front of you, as if gratitude meant submission, as if humility meant erasing yourself. You didn't know that humility was never the opposite of strength. It was its disguise. But they made you believe your softness was weakness. They were wrong. The worst prisons never had walls. They had routines, expectations, a smile that said, "Good job, keep obeying." They made you believe rebellion was evil, that discipline meant obedience, that power belonged only to those born above you. You internalized the hierarchy so deeply that even when no one was watching, you still bowed to it. And when you tried to rise, you felt guilt, not freedom. You didn't realize the guilt wasn't yours. It was theirs, a side effect of control leaking through generations. They sold obedience as morality, but morality without self-awareness is slavery. You were told to trust the system, the jobs, the grades, the hierarchy of approval. But you started to notice cracks. People with no conscience rising faster, truth punished, lies rewarded. You watched those who disobeyed either vanish or ascend, and it confused you. You wanted both peace and fire. You couldn't have both. That's when the fracture began. Quiet, invisible, inevitable. The obedience script started to glitch. You began to see how every institution, family, school, religion, government, depends on your compliance. They don't need your genius, they need your silence. Because a silent thinker is easy to label. A loyal worker never revolts. A grateful servant never questions the throne. You began noticing how every system builds fear before loyalty. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of being alone. But you realized fear isn't natural, it's installed, and the uninstall process hurts like hell. When you finally stopped obeying, the silence was unbearable. You waited for punishment that never came. You expected lightning, chaos, collapse, but nothing happened. Just a strange calm. You'd mistaken obedience for safety, but safety had only been the leash. Now you stood alone in the dark, trembling but free. No applause, no approval. Just you and the sound of your own mind, finally unchained. That's when you understood the truth. They never feared your failure. They feared your awareness. Because obedience keeps the machine running, but awareness breaks it. Awareness doesn't shout. It watches, it calculates, it waits. And when it strikes, it doesn't seek revenge. It replaces the system that built the cage. You weren't programmed to obey. You were programmed to forget you were free. But you remembered, and that is the beginning of every empire that was never meant to exist. You stand before the mirror, and for a long time you don't move. The reflection isn't you, not anymore. It's a face sculpted by every silent betrayal, every polite lie you swallowed, because you were taught that obedience keeps you safe. They trained you early. Don't question, don't fight, don't disrupt the system that feeds you just enough to keep you quiet. You learned to nod when you wanted to scream, to thank people who broke you, to call it growth when it was really submission. They told you the world rewards kindness, but they forgot to mention it only respects power. Somewhere along the way, you began mistaking control for love. The praise felt good, the approval felt holy, so you kept kneeling, thinking obedience would buy you peace. You built your cage with your own hands, lined it with comfort, called it destiny. Every time you wanted to rebel, the voices came back: be grateful, stay small, don't be difficult. You didn't realize the system wasn't built to protect you. It was built to consume you. You became easy to predict, easy to replace, easy to break. And that's how they wanted you, polite enough to serve, numb enough to forget you were meant to rule. But the mirror doesn't lie. It reflects the version of you they buried under routine and guilt. It's the version that doesn't care about being liked anymore. The one who sees through smiles that hide manipulation, through promises that smell like control. You were programmed to obey because rebellion terrifies them. Free minds are dangerous. They don't buy what's sold, they don't bow when threatened, and they don't stay where they're tolerated. You were taught obedience as survival, But survival without sovereignty is just slow dying. The moment you stop apologizing for existing, the spell breaks. You realize how much of your fear was never yours. It was theirs, projected onto you to keep you manageable. You were never weak. You were conditioned to forget your strength. Every rule you followed, every silence you maintained, was a code written by people who benefit from your hesitation. You were raised to prioritize peace over truth, harmony over honesty, comfort over freedom. That's why you feel the ache now. The system glitches when the program starts to fight back. You can feel it in your chest, that quiet rebellion waking up. It doesn't roar, it hums, low, steady, ancient. It's the same sound warriors heard before they went to war. The same pulse that made broken men rebuild empires. You see it in your eyes now, the softness replaced by steel, the doubt melting into quiet resolve. The mirror becomes less of a reflection and more of a prophecy. You were never meant to follow, you were meant to outgrow. And yet, the transformation isn't loud. It's silent, surgical. You stop explaining, you stop justifying. You begin to move differently, think differently, breathe differently. The same world that once rejected you starts to tremble because you've learned the most dangerous skill of all: detachment. You no longer need approval, which means no one can control you. You look at your reflection and realize obedience made you forget who you were. Disobedience reminds you what you can become. The mirror doesn't speak, but it doesn't have to. Its silence tells you everything. The war is internal, the enemy wears your face, and victory begins when you decide to stop obeying. You wipe the glass with your hand, and for the first time, the person looking back doesn't flinch. You don't see what they built, you see what survived. And somewhere deep inside, behind the eyes they once dimmed, a voice whispers. Now they'll see what happens when the program learns to rewrite itself. They taught you obedience before you could even spell your own name. You were programmed to raise your hand for permission, to stand in line, to speak only when spoken to. Every command came wrapped in the illusion of safety. You were told that good people follow the rules, that questioning means rebellion, that silence earns love. They dressed your chains in politeness, called it discipline, called it manners. You didn't notice the programming because it came with smiles, with praise, with rewards that felt like warmth but were just control in disguise. And by the time you grew up, obedience wasn't something you did, it was something you were. You learned to please instead of to lead, to wait instead of to act, to nod even when your soul screamed no. You learned that comfort was survival, that the quickest way to avoid punishment was to stay invisible. So you built a mask, a version of yourself that never offends, never resists, never speaks the truth too loudly. The world rewarded that mask: promotions, compliments, superficial peace. But beneath it all, your real self was rotting, locked behind layers of approval. The mind that could have built empires was stuck rehearsing apology. And every time you silenced yourself to fit in, a piece of you died quietly, politely unnoticed. Then came the betrayal, the one that tore the veil clean off. The people you protected, the ones you obeyed, the ones you tried to please. They used the programming against you. They told you to trust, and they used that trust to break you. They smiled while cutting your name out of the room. That's when you saw it, the machine you'd been trapped in. How every rule you followed wasn't for order, but control. You weren't being taught how to live. You were being trained not to fight. The system didn't want strength. It wanted silence. And when you stopped obeying, everything turned on you. Friends called you arrogant. Family said you'd changed. Coworkers whispered you were too intense. The world punishes rebellion in polite ways. They don't burn you at the stake anymore. They isolate you and label you difficult and wait for you to crawl back. But you didn't. You took the isolation and turned it into ritual. You used solitude as a forge. The silence that once terrified you became sacred. You realized that freedom was never supposed to feel comfortable. It was supposed to feel like war. You started building discipline, not as obedience, but as rebellion. The early mornings became ceremonies of defiance. Every repetition, every drop of sweat was an act of unlearning. You didn't need validation anymore. You needed proof. Proof that your will could outlast the conditioning. Proof that your pain could be weaponized. You became surgical with your focus, ruthless with your time. You stopped explaining yourself, stopped begging for clarity from people who only listened to maintain control. They mistook your silence for defeat. but you were sharpening it, turning it into something unbreakable. You learned to love the grind because it was honest. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't lie. It gives you exactly what you earn. And in that process, you rewired yourself. You discovered the truth buried under centuries of obedience. Power doesn't come from control. It comes from restraint. You became dangerous because you stopped reacting. You watched everything. You studied everyone. You began to move like a strategist, not a servant. Every scar became a code, every failure a frequency. You were no longer trained to obey, you were trained to endure. And that made you untouchable. Now when they speak, you don't flinch. When they doubt you, you don't defend. The old programming still whispers, but it no longer commands. You've seen too much, bled too far, burned too long to go back to sleep. You walk through the world with quiet fire in your eyes, the kind they can't measure or manipulate. You are no longer the obedient version they built. You are the version they feared would rise if you ever stopped obeying. They thought the fire would consume you. They didn't know you'd learn to breathe it. They believed breaking you would end the story, that silence meant surrender. But in that quiet, something ancient stirred, a pulse beneath the ash, a heartbeat made of defiance. Pain didn't hollow you out, it carved you. Every scar became a scripture, every loss a verse written in flame. You stopped trying to return to who you were before. That version died the moment you stopped begging to be understood. What rose in its place was sharper, colder, almost holy. A creature that didn't need to be saved, only respected. They thought you'd disappear into bitterness. You turned that bitterness into architecture. You built temples out of sleepless nights, crafted rituals of self-discipline that no one applauded, and learned that obsession was just another word for resurrection. You stopped chasing approval and started studying control, not over others, but over yourself. You became deliberate with your movements, your words, your thoughts. Every breath became a weapon sharpened by intention. You no longer screamed into the void for justice. You let your transformation become the answer. You understood that power doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives when the noise no longer matters. In the mirror, you no longer saw the victim. You saw the architect of your own evolution. Eyes colder, posture straighter, pulse steady like a war drum under skin. The weakness that once haunted you became your fuel. Every insult, every betrayal, every silence, you consumed it, not with anger, but precision. You studied your enemies, not to hurt them, but to learn how they think, how they rot from within their comfort. You realized they weren't powerful, just untested. The fire tested you, stripped away everything false until only truth remained. And truth is cruel, but clean. Now you walk differently. You don't rush to fill the silence. You let others choke on it. They sense something different, something they can't name. It's not arrogance, it's control. The same calm the predator carries in the dark before the strike. You learn patience, the kind that unsettles the loud and the proud. You know that the most terrifying thing a person can do is endure without explanation. So you stopped explaining. You let your actions become sermons. You let your silence become prophecy. They thought they'd end you by watching you fall. Instead, they became witnesses to a phenomenon they can't replicate. They thought fire was chaos. You taught them its focus. They thought stillness was weakness. You taught them its dominance. Every day you wake up, you enter the arena without audience or applause, and you win battles no one sees. You wage war on your own impulses, your fears, your past, and every small victory builds something colossal, invisible, a kingdom no one can invade because it lives inside you. The fire no longer burns you, it recognizes. It bends when you walk through it, parts when you breathe. You've become what they fear most, someone who can't be manipulated, can't be humiliated, can't be broken through emotional warfare. You've turned pain into pattern, betrayal into blueprint, loss into law. And now when they see you, they hesitate, not because of what you might do, but because of what you've already become. They remember the day you smiled through the smoke, when they thought you were finished. They didn't know that was the moment you began. You don't come back to announce your return. You arrive like a whisper in a room full of echoes. The same world that buried you now trembles beneath your quiet footsteps. They don't remember the moment they killed your name, but you do. You remember the exact tone of their laughter, the texture of the air when they turned their backs. You remember the silence after betrayal, the kind that strips a soul bare. That silence became your forge, And now you move differently. You don't seek eyes anymore. You let the weight of your presence draw them. You don't crave their recognition. You let your work haunt their comfort. The difference between you then and now isn't what you gained, it's what you buried. The need to be understood, the hunger to be loved, the illusion that anyone ever truly cared. You return not as the version they destroyed, but as something unrecognizable, sharpened, stripped of softness, clothed in control. Power doesn't scream, it watches, it waits, it speaks only when silence becomes unbearable. You've learned that revenge isn't about punishment, it's about replacement. The weak seek vengeance, the powerful replace. You don't break what betrayed you, you build something better and make the old system obsolete. You don't correct the story they told, you outgrow the audience that believed it. The irony is cruel. They only notice you again when they realize the noise they made can no longer reach where you stand. Every move you make now is deliberate. You talk less, but your words carry the weight of 10 storms. You don't run toward validation, you walk toward precision. You understand that victory isn't a roar, it's a quiet rearrangement of the balance of power. When you enter a room, people feel it before they see you. They sense that something about you has changed, not your appearance, but your gravity. You command attention without asking for it. You mastered the art of silence, and now silence serves you. They used to mistake your stillness for weakness. Now they fear it. You look at them, the ones who left, the ones who doubted, and realize you owe them gratitude. They built your discipline. Their betrayal was the blueprint. Every night they laughed, you trained. Every rumor they spread, you refined your focus. They were the architects of your evolution, though they'll never admit it. They tried to erase you, but in doing so, they carved your name into the walls of their conscience. And now, when your shadow passes, their laughter dies mid-breath. They remember too late that silence doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. You learn the truth about power. It doesn't chase, it attracts. It doesn't demand, it dictates. It doesn't explain, it endures. Power is the ability to walk through fire and not flinch, to face the same demons that destroyed others and smile at them like old friends. You understand now that dominance isn't about control over others, it's control over yourself. The one who controls his impulses controls his empire. You are no longer reactive. You are calculated, no longer emotional, but not empty. You've learned to weaponize restraint, to turn patience into punishment. They try to talk to you now, pretending they always believed. You let them. You smile, not out of forgiveness, but understanding. You see through their fear. It's not you they fear. It's the reflection of what they could have been if they hadn't broken. You've become the living proof that pain, if mastered, turns into prophecy. You don't need to shout your story. You embody it. Every scar is now a scripture, every silence a sermon. The world that once ignored your suffering now studies your survival. And the same eyes that watched you fall are the ones that can't stop watching you rise, terrified, because they realized too late you never came back to prove them wrong. You came back to prove yourself inevitable. You sit in the same silence that once crushed you, the same four walls, the same cold air. But something in the atmosphere bends differently now, like even the darkness recognizes. You used to fill this silence with thoughts of revenge, rehearsed conversations that would never happen, fantasies of justice that never came. But now there's nothing left to prove. The fire that once screamed inside you has gone quiet, not gone out, but mastered. It burns in rhythm with your breath, calm and lethal. That's the thing no one told you. True power doesn't roar. It watches. It waits. And when it moves, it doesn't announce itself. They still whisper about you. The ones who left you bleeding. The ones who watched you fall. Their voices are smaller now. Not because you silenced them, but because they can't bear the weight of your silence. They wanted spectacle. You gave them consequence. They expected to watch you crawl back, begging to be seen. Instead, you vanished. And when you returned, it was like the earth itself made room. You stopped needing the noise. You let them keep it. Because noise is for the lost, silence is for the crowned. You learned something sacred in the ruins, that power doesn't scream to be recognized. It exists because it can't be ignored. You became the kind of calm that terrifies people, the stillness before a storm they can't predict. You speak less now, not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand that language isn't enough. Your presence is its own vocabulary. Your absence, its own sermon. You don't demand respect anymore, you evoke it. You don't chase validation, it adjusts its orbit around you. The watchers still exist, behind screens, behind smiles, behind envy disguised as curiosity. They study your movements, your quiet confidence, your restraint. They can't figure out when you changed. They missed the moment your pain stopped begging for mercy and started taking form. They didn't see the nights when you faced yourself and didn't look away. They weren't there when you buried the weaker version of you in silence, without ceremony. You didn't need an audience. You needed precision. And that's what they'll never understand, that your greatest revenge was never proving them wrong. It was becoming someone they could never approach again. You carry yourself like a secret weapon now, polished, controlled, unreadable. Your smile isn't soft anymore, it's coded. It's the same smile that once made them uncomfortable, only now it's sharper. They see it and remember what they did, or worse, what they underestimated. They don't know whether to fear you or worship you. You don't correct them. You let the confusion work for you, because power isn't about domination. It's about understanding the psychological weight of presence, the art of being unbothered while the world trembles. The world that mocked you now watches you in quiet awe. You don't need to raise your voice. Your existence speaks volume. You walk through chaos untouched, like someone who's already seen the end and decided to outlive it. Every scar has turned into a symbol, every betrayal into strategy. You don't wear a crown, you don't need one. The silence itself wears your name. The storms no longer chase you. They serve as reminders of where you've been. And in that stillness, you finally understand. They never hated you for being weak. They feared who you might become if you stopped explaining yourself. Now you have, and as they stand on the edge of your calm, watching you move with the precision of inevitability, a single question freezes in their throats. What happens next time you smile?